Mysteries. They fascinate us. There's something about the unknown that just fascinates us. Like a car crash we can't look away from thanks to morbid curiosity. We have a desire for answers, and when there aren't any available for us, our imaginations run wild with speculation and theories about what really happened. This desire exists in every single one of us, and if the story is strange enough, it becomes a famous legend that sticks with us through the ages. And I wanted to go through some of those stories today because I think they're pretty cool, and if you think they're cool too, I thank you for watching, and let's get into it. But before that, a quick disclaimer. If you are someone who is squeamish to descriptions of death or dead bodies, you should probably sit this one out. I've done what I can to keep them from being overly graphic, but the descriptions are still there because they are true things that happened to real people, and I think it's important to tell their stories. So if you aren't able to handle that, please go watch another of my videos that doesn't include these kind of descriptions. All right, now that you've been warned, let's get into it. Jack the Ripper is probably the most famous unidentified serial killer in history, with at least 5 confirmed victims in 1888 and several considered probable victims from 1888 to 1891. All the targets of Jack the Ripper were women and were carried out in extremely brutal fashion. Again, I won't go into too many details here, but one of the ways that police knew the murders were linked was due to the fact that the victims' throats were slit in the same direction and down all the way to the vertebrae, which takes some pretty serious aggression and force. The murderer also removed many of the internal organs from his victims, at one point taking a kidney and another time the heart. And the brutality of the murders would be enough to make this case famous, but something else the killer did would cement his horrific legacy and inspire dozens of serial killers since. He wrote letters to the police. Now, the police at the time were receiving hundreds of letters from all sorts of people. Those who thought they were helping by giving advice on how to catch him, letters complaining that the police were incompetent because they hadn't found him yet, and there were even those claiming to be the murderer but only copied information that had been released to the paper, so they were determined to be false. However, there were 3 letters that proved to be from the killer himself. The way that the police figured out the letters were legitimate was that they were postmarked before any information about the killings the letter described had been made public. Also, one of them included a human kidney. Yeah, the killer sent a small package with one of the letters, and inside was part of a human kidney preserved in alcohol. Also, the letters to the police are where the name Jack the Ripper comes from, as it is how the legitimate letters were signed. But despite all the work that was done to investigate the murders and the implementation of local safety groups in the area, the killer was never identified and no arrest was ever made. In the following years, several other murders occurred in Whitechapel, but none of them could be conclusively linked to Jack the Ripper. And theories abound about the identity of the killer. During the time of the murders, it was suspected that he was a butcher due to the severe mutilations of the victims, possibly a barber, maybe fueled by people being familiar with the Sweeney Todd legend, and even a ship worker due to the timing of the murders and the fact that the London docks were very close to Whitechapel. And as years have gone by, some fairly wild accusations and theories have surfaced, some more believable than others. There's one stating that H.H. Holmes, the American serial killer, actually started killing as Jack the Ripper before returning to Chicago, which I could potentially believe, although Holmes was dealing with a lawsuit and several businesses in 1888, so it seems kind of unlikely. The wilder ones include theories that, like, Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, was the killer, and that really only played on the idea that the killer was an upper-class man who preyed on the poor. There's no real evidence for this claim. Ultimately, the mystery of Jack the Ripper is an unfortunate tale about crime in a deeply impoverished area due to a number of factors, ranging from police incompetence, lack of resources, and the fact that it's been 140 years, will likely never be solved. And if you thought that depressingly grisly murders were only for the British, this sad story will correct that silly thinking because we're going to Los Angeles, although it's before all the crack and homeless feces took over. Wait, did they even have crack back in the 1940s? Anyway, I'm getting distracted. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, the corpse of a young woman was discovered in the mostly undeveloped neighborhood of what is now Leimert Park, Los Angeles. The body was discovered naked, completely drained of blood, severed in half at the waist, with the intestines tucked underneath the lower half, and with a Glasgow smile cut into the mouth. Think Joker from The Dark Knight. The body was also positioned in a suggestive pose with the legs spread apart and the arms above the head. The body was transported to the Los Angeles County coroner, where an autopsy was performed and fingerprints taken to be sent to the FBI for identification. She was then identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short from Boston, Massachusetts, and the investigation began with the LAPD, Los Angeles Sheriffs, and California State Police putting 750 investigators on the case. Numerous suspects were brought in and questioned, with some of them making confessions that were determined to be false. And all the while, the media was spinning the story and creating national headlines. And I'll get to the media coverage in a bit because it is one of the worst things I have ever seen. But before that, just like the previous murderer, the killer of the Black Dahlia sent journalists letters and property that had belonged to Short, although no organs were included this time. The letters told the media and police that the killer would soon turn themselves in, only for the time that the letter stated for this would pass, and the next letter would say that the killer had changed his mind. This was all frustrating, but it also wasn't helped by just some weird and downright unlucky stuff happening. For starters was the fact that fingerprints were recovered from some of Short's belongings that had been mailed to the press. However, the fingerprints were damaged while in transit to the FBI and were basically useless. Then there was that time that a bundle of clothes was found on a beach with an apparent suicide note that confessed to the murder. However, nothing was found in the clothing to give any leads as to who they belonged to, and it was ultimately a dead end. The police did their best to investigate the murder and even believed it to be linked to the Cleveland Torso murders that occurred from 1934 to 1938. What are the Cleveland Torso murders, you ask? We'll get there. Ultimately, no conclusive evidence as to the identity of the killer was ever found, and it has long since been labeled a cold case. And just like any unsolved killing, it has those who have come forward in the more modern age to state that they knew the killer or that it was a family member, but it never led to anything. And now, let's go back to the media. When Short was very first identified as the victim of the killing, that information was released to the press, probably in a bid to find people who knew or were close to her. And the journalists did just that. A journalist by the name of Wayne Sutton with the Los Angeles Examiner called Short's mother in Boston to deliver the news of her death. But first, he decided to tell her that her daughter was the winner of a beauty contest and that he was interviewing her for an article about it. After getting as much personal information from the mother as possible, he then delivered the news that her daughter actually had not won a beauty contest, but had in fact been murdered. And if you think that's bad, which it is, you ain't seen nothing yet. The newspaper offered to fly the mother out to Los Angeles to help aid in the investigation, only to keep her far away from the police so they could write more sensationalized articles. Oh, and something else interesting. Why isn't this case known as the Elizabeth Short murder? Well, because the media took the fact that she was a fairly attractive and well-dressed young woman to spin the story that she was a sex fiend who was murdered for being an adventuress, and they based the name off of the film The Blue Dahlia, where an unfaithful woman is murdered. So yeah, it turns out that the media has pretty much always sucked, and I don't know what it will be like for Wayne Sutton on Judgment Day, but I hope that this incident takes up a good chunk of his time. I honestly don't even want to talk about theories. I'm so mad about this one. This poor woman had a whole life ahead of her that was destroyed by a monster, and then these monsters in suits with notepads come along and drag her bifurcated corpse through the mud just to sell more newspapers. Alright, I didn't have a Russian mystery in the last video, so I'll make up for it here. Grigori Rasputin was born to peasant parents in the middle of nowhere Siberia, Russia in 1869. Almost nothing is verifiably known about his youth, other than the fact that he grew up poor, was likely illiterate until his early adulthood, and partook in a good amount of drinking. You know, typical peasant stuff. The next thing we know for sure is in 1897, he became interested in religion and took a pilgrimage that landed him at a monastery, which likely taught him how to read and write as well as basic monastic practices. After leaving the monastery, he continued to wander around the Russian countryside and developed a reputation as a mystic and a healer, eventually making his way to St. Petersburg, where the elites in the city became fascinated by his ideas and his mannerisms. There was a huge interest in the supernatural and occult magic that drew people of all kinds to Rasputin, especially the Tsar. Now, why would the Tsar of Russia, one of the most powerful men in the entire world, want anything to do with a supposed holy healer? To save his son. The Tsar and his wife had 5 children, 4 girls and 1 boy, and their boy had a medical condition known as hemophilia. Basically, anytime he became injured, or even if he just got shaken up by riding in a carriage on a bumpy road, he would begin to bleed excessively, both internally and externally. His bleeding was so bad at one point that it was thought that he was going to die. The Tsar's wife sent a telegram to Rasputin in Siberia, who told her to keep the doctors away from the boy and that he would pray for the child and that the child would survive. To everyone's surprise, the child recovered very quickly, going from being on his deathbed to up and playing in a matter of days. This solidified Rasputin's relationship with the Tsar and his wife, and they would spend a ton of time living in the palace together and partying with the nobility. And when I say party, I mean engaging in depraved sexual acts that helped the entire nation turn against the Tsar and the government, and may have helped lead to the Russian Revolution. There was even speculation that he had been sleeping with the Queen. Not a great look. But if only there was a group of people that had the influence and knowledge of Rasputin that they could get him alone and, I don't know, kill him? Oh, there is? Hooray! Rasputin was invited to a party at the palace of Prince Felix Yusupov, where he was fed cakes and tea that were laced with cyanide. But to the surprise of everyone in attendance, he was completely unbothered by this. After several hours, nothing had happened, and Yusupov got tired of waiting, so he went upstairs, grabbed his pistol, and shot Rasputin in the chest. But apparently that didn't work either, because Rasputin got up and attacked Yusupov, who ran out into the courtyard where some other conspirators shot Rasputin several more times, once in the forehead. They then wrapped him in a cloth and tossed him into the river, where his body was recovered several days later. And all the information I just gave you about how he was killed is solely based on pieced-together testimonies from Yusupov in the years after. And the circumstances of his death, just like his life, have garnered a ton of speculation and theories about who or what he really was. Theories like he was the Antichrist, that he was an incarnation of Satan himself, or that he was just possessed by demons that gave him supernatural abilities. And even the story of his death has theories that he wasn't actually dead when he was thrown into the river, despite the fact that there was no water found in his lungs during the autopsy. Oh, and, there's a bullet hole in his forehead. But what fascinates me the most about this story is the idea that he was a healer who was blessed by God to save people from illness and disease, which is what he and at least some members of the Russian clergy believed. However, I have my doubts, considering that Rasputin was known for telling women that in order for his healing powers to work, he had to enter them. Yeah, if I was in a hospital and some smelly Russian giant was trying to hook up with women by telling them he was sent by God and only by having sex with him could they be healed, I'd probably commit at least one felony. In the end, I don't think he was possessed by a demon, nor do I believe he was a holy healer. I believe he was a man who figured out how to manipulate people based on their own fears and desires during one of the most difficult times in Russian history. Also, he definitely did heal Tsar Nicholas's son of hemophilia, but that was because he took him off the aspirin the doctors prescribed him, which was not known to be a blood thinner at the time, and he likely did it just to show that the doctors didn't know what they were doing, and it was just a coincidence that it had worked. And while Rasputin deserved to die for a multitude of reasons, Anastasia, Tsar Nicholas's 17-year-old daughter, did not deserve it. Shortly after Rasputin's death, Russia found itself embroiled in a revolution which saw the rule of the Tsars come to an end, and Nicholas and his family removed from the royal palace. Not long after the revolution, the Russian Civil War began, and Nicholas and his family were taken into custody by the Revolution Royal Red Army, who was fighting the somewhat pro-monarchy White Army. One night, the White Army was approaching the city where the Red Army was holding the royal family, and when they arrived, the royal family was nowhere to be found. The only trace of them that was found was personal belongings discarded in a mine shaft near the city. The fact that no bodies were discovered by the White Army led to theories that somehow they may have survived and gone into hiding. And in the coming years, supposed sightings of the Princess Anastasia were reported all over Europe, continuing to grow the intrigue and theory that she had survived. Then, one night, an unknown woman speaking German with a heavy Russian accent was rescued from jumping off a bridge in Berlin. She had no papers and refused to identify herself, and doctors noticed that she had scars on her head and body. While recovering in a mental hospital, a fellow patient started claiming that this unknown woman was one of the daughters of the Russian royal family. Eventually, this news made it to people who had been close to them. Some of these people, including relatives and close friends of the family, visited, with some remaining unconvinced that this woman was the lost princess. However, some close friends of the family believed that this was in fact Anastasia and secured her release from the hospital to live in the city. What followed was several years of the Tsar's relatives and friends paying for her to live in various places around Europe, as well as covering medical bills, as she was in a very low mental and physical state. And all the while, public claims from family and friends that she was in fact Princess Anastasia helped fuel the theory that somehow the princess had survived. And as time went on, the number of supporters and doubters grew, with her eventually being moved to the United States, and one of her biggest supporters, Gleb Botkin, hiring a lawyer. The reason he had hired a lawyer was in order to obtain the estate that belonged to the Tsar. See, there was a large amount of wealth that existed in the estate, and there was nobody to claim it since there hadn't really been any proof that the Tsar had been murdered. But perhaps if this woman is the surviving daughter of the Tsar, that money could be collected by her, and the lawyer would obviously take a very handsome fee. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's basically the plot of the 90s film Anastasia. Except unlike in that movie where the Dowager Empress, mother of the Tsar, accepts Anastasia and they live happily ever after, in real life she denounces this woman as an imposter. And this pattern of trying to gain the fortune, and some people believing she was Anastasia and some thinking she was a fraud, continued for years, with her main supporter eventually dying destitute after spending all his money trying to get the Tsar's fortune. She would spend the rest of her life being cared for by nurses and care facilities before having a stroke and passing away in June of 1984. And for quite a while, her claim to being Anastasia still garnered attention, that is until the Soviet Union fell. In 1991, the bodies of the Tsar, his wife, and 3 of their children were found in a mass grave outside the town where they had been held, but Anastasia and Alexei were missing. So the theory gained some more steam up until 2007, when the bodies of Alexei and Anastasia were finally found and proven using DNA evidence. And I know that this is now a solved mystery, but what fascinates me more is the reaction to this woman. So many people believe that she was the missing daughter of the last Tsar, but why? I think it's because they wanted to believe it. In the years that followed World War I, there was still this idea in the public that soldiers in war know not to harm women and children, and because of this, it means that the children of the Tsar must have escaped, even though the reality, whether people could believe it or not, is that she was shot in a basement in 1918 by a group of drunken guards who couldn't let the Tsar and his family be rescued. This story serves as a great example of people, whether intentionally or not, opening themselves up to being taken advantage of because they don't want to face the dark reality of life. Boy, that was a depressing note to end on. What story's next? On February 24th, 1978, 5 men, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Weher, Jack Madruga, and Gary Mathias, drove a 1969 Mercury Montego from Yuba City, California to a basketball game in Chico. After leaving the game and grabbing some snacks at a convenience store, the men in the car left Chico to return home. However, they never made it back to Yuba City, and the car was later found abandoned 70 miles east of Chico in the Plumas National Forest. At this point, the men had been reported missing, and investigators quickly searched the vehicle and the surrounding area for any sign of the men. But aside from the wrappers from the snacks they bought and a road map neatly folded in the front seat, nothing was found. The search was expanded deeper into the forest, but was called off due to severe snowstorms that almost led to rescuers being lost themselves. However, the investigative efforts continued, with interviews being conducted with the parents of the 5 men, attendees of the basketball game, and the employees of the convenience store the men visited before driving into the mountain. But no break was made in the case as to the whereabouts of the men until June 4th. With the higher temperatures of spring and now the start of summer, most of the snow in the higher elevations melted away, allowing for easier access to the area where the car had been found. And on June 4th, a group of motorcyclists made their way to a trailer that belonged to the United States Forest Service at a campsite roughly 20 miles from where the group's car had been found. They noticed that one of the windows on the trailer was broken, and when they opened the door, they were met with the stench of a decaying body inside. They contacted authorities who took over the scene and would later identify the body as Ted Weher. This reinvigorated searches in the area between the trailer and the location of the car, where researchers would find the remains of several other men. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling's remains were found 11.5 miles from the car, but had to be identified through DNA because the bodies had been scavenged by wild animals, with only scattered bones remaining. They were determined to have died from hypothermia, with theories stating that one of them was in the late stages of hypothermia, where your body forces you to go to sleep, and the other refused to leave his friend behind, leading them both to perish. Jack Hewitt's backbone and some of his clothing were found by his father, who had joined the search party, and his skull was found later by a deputy, allowing dental records to be used to identify him. So these 3 deaths seem fairly cut and dry. 3 men trying to make their way through the winter weather who got lost and succumbed to hypothermia. But what about Weher's death? And maybe more importantly, where was Gary Mathias? The first question is easy and very unfortunate to solve. Weir's body was found wrapped in 8 sheets on a bed inside the trailer, and his autopsy revealed that he had died from a combination of starvation and hypothermia. What the autopsy also revealed was that due to the growth of his beard, it was estimated that he lived for nearly 3 months after his last shave, which was an unknown amount of time before the disappearance, but still just sounds horrific to have spent an unknown amount of time, and up to 2 to 3 months living in this trailer, just slowly dying. He was found to have severe frostbite on his feet and was wearing his own clothing under the blankets, but oddly enough, his shoes were missing. Which leads us to the next question. Where is Gary Mathias? As searchers had spread throughout the area, they eventually found 3 Forest Service blankets and a flashlight roughly a quarter mile northwest of the trailer, assumed to have belonged to Mathias as he was the only other person thought to have made it to the trailer. However, no other trace of Mathias has ever been found, and this is where the story gets a ton of theories and just really, really sad. When investigators looked into the trailer where Weir was found, they discovered that the fireplace inside the trailer was never used, despite the fact that there was plenty of matches and books inside the trailer that could have been burned as kindling. They also found that heavy winter clothing that was stored in the trailer had been untouched. Investigators also found about 3 dozen ration cans from an outside storage shed had been eaten, but a larger store of rations in the same shed had not been touched. The trailer also had a butane heating system that had never been turned on. So why, with all the resources for warmth and enough food to survive almost a year, was Weher found dead from starvation and hypothermia? Well, that's where the sad part comes in. All 5 of these men were diagnosed with mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions of some kind, and the reason they went to the basketball game in the first place was because they were part of a league for people with those kinds of disabilities, and they loved playing basketball and showing their support for other teams in the region. In fact, they were supposed to be playing a basketball game the following day after their disappearance. During the investigation, Weir's family told investigators that he lacked a level of common sense due to his cognitive disability. They gave examples of him asking why they had to stop at stop signs, or that one night they had to drag him out of bed during a house fire because he was worried he wouldn't get enough sleep and be late for work. The disabilities that the men had could also serve as an explanation as to why they didn't try to push the car out of the snowbank it got stuck in, or even just stay in the car with the heater on until daylight. And this has unfortunately led some people at the time and around the internet to say things like they chose to starve to death in a shack full of food, or simply coming out and saying that this is just a story of 5 retards dying in the mountains, and not in the 90s way, but in the derogatory sense. There are also theories that Mathias, who had previously been psychiatrically discharged from the army as a schizophrenic, had forced all of them to leave the vehicle, where he then left Weir in the trailer to die and made his getaway. And while that theory would help explain why he was gone and nobody else was found, it doesn't make much sense to me why Matthias would leave Weir in the trailer, cover him in blankets if he was just gonna let him die. I also would think he would have taken the gold necklace and the cash from Weir's wallet if he was actually a bad actor. No, my theory, which is unfortunately the saddest one, is that the men got stuck in a snowbank and, possibly due to their stress compounded with their disabilities, decided to walk along a snowcat trail until they made it to the trailer. 3 of the men were not dressed for the weather and were unable to or refused to go further and perished from hypothermia along the way. Weir and Matthias were able to make it to the trailer, but Weir's frostbitten feet made it to where he couldn't go on, and he became bedridden, where Matthias did what he could to take care of his friend, but possibly due to his own mental condition, couldn't use the tools that were available to him. Eventually, he may have thought that the only way to help him was to try and walk back towards civilization, but he never made it. Ultimately, we'll never know unless Matthias somehow survived and comes out of hiding, or his body is discovered somewhere in the Sierra Mountains. Regardless, it's just a really sad story of a group of friends that succumbed to the elements after needlessly getting stuck in the mountains. Okay, let's get away from one of the saddest stories I've ever read to something that could be explained by aliens. On March 8th, 2014, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 departed from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia, bound for Beijing, China. 38 minutes into the flight, the aircraft took a sharp turn to the west and continued flying into the Indian Ocean before it dropped off all radar. What followed is the most expensive and extensive search for a lost aircraft in history. The search took 3 years and covered over 45,000 square miles of the Indian Ocean and turned up nothing. But what caused the plane to fly so far off course? Was it an error with the navigation equipment, a pilot with a death wish, that the military mistook it for an enemy aircraft, or perhaps aliens? As far as what the final fate of the plane was, that's pretty obvious. It crashed into the ocean with no survivors. But what is more fascinating to me is the flight path. No matter how bad your communication or navigation equipment is, if you took off north and that's the direction of your destination, you aren't going to pull an almost 360-degree turn. Another factor that is crazy to me is that the pilots last communicated with air traffic control was long before the location of the plane was lost. I don't know, but I like the theory of a suicidal pilot who planned the whole thing and then something in his plan went wrong, but that opens up a lot more questions about him overpowering and incapacitating his co-pilot, which seems more improbable but more fascinating to me. The Northwest Passage is a famed route around North America through the Arctic and was expected to be the faster trade route to India rather than going around the Horn of Africa. And throughout the 1800s, it became a prize for explorers to claim to be the first to navigate the passage. And one of the most famous expeditions that set out in 1845 was the Franklin Expedition, headed by Captains John Franklin and Francis Crozier. The expedition sailed from England to Greenland and then into the unknown passage. There they were met with a multitude of problems. Their navigation equipment malfunctioned, the maps they were using were incomplete, and many of the modern pieces of technology that were being used by the expedition actually may have been what killed them. Oh, sorry, spoiler alert, every member of this crew died in some of the worst ways imaginable. The ships became trapped in the ice in one of the choke points of the passage between several islands. But that was no big deal because they expected that they would spend at least one winter on the ice. It would thaw and then they would continue on their journey. Only there was one problem. The ice didn't thaw. After spending well over a year in the ice and running into rationing issues, the crews abandoned the ships, taking lifeboats and supplies to try and make it to the Backfish River, 250 miles away. From there, the goal was to take the boats down the river until they made it to an outpost several hundred miles south. Now, the chances of healthy men doing this were slim, but at this point, none of them were healthy. In fact, their bodies were likely falling apart day by day. Remember what I said about the expedition being equipped with the best new technology at the time? Well, that included a water purification system and a brand new invention at the time, canned food. With canned food, the rations would last so much longer than any more fresh or dried goods that the ship could have taken with them, And with a water purification system, they could melt the ice, purify the salt out of it, and boom, an endless supply of clean drinking water. Except there was only one problem. The Admiralty had given the contract for the cans to the lowest bidder, meaning as many as a third of them were improperly sealed, and the solder that was used was lead, meaning that the lead was seeping into their food, causing lead poisoning. And the tainted food is often blamed for the death of the sailors, but I think the water purification system holds just as much, if not more, blame. The system was made up of lead-soldered pipes, meaning that the crew was being poisoned as soon as they left home. And when I say they died horrifically, I mean it. Lead poisoning is a very slow, painful process where every process that your body normally does to keep you alive and functioning slowly stops. It leads to incredible pain in your bones, muscles, and joints, and even prevents wounds from healing, and can even make old wounds open up again, meaning that every stumble or cut that these men suffered would be incredibly painful and likely never heal. Well, I mean, that seems pretty cut and dry, right? The men left the ship in 1848 and died the same year, right? So why would this be included in a list of mysteries? Because maybe they didn't all die. The region where the ships were lost is inhabited by the Inuit people, and when other explorers came to the region in search for the expedition, they interviewed the natives, some of which claimed to have met the explorers. They showed the rescue parties trinkets like buttons and silverware that they had traded with this group of starving men in exchange for food. One of them was able to identify Captain Crozier from a photograph, stating that him and another man had been living in the area of Baker Lake between 1852 and 1858, meaning that of 129 crewmen, possibly 2 of them managed to survive nearly a decade after abandoning the ships. Now, do I believe that anyone could survive that long? Honestly, I kind of like to think so. The idea of 2 men watching their fellow crew members decay and die only to refuse to do so and make it so close to civilization. I don't know, it's a really cool story, and I like to think that Crozier made it. There's also a theory that the survivors just started living with the Inuit people and kept that a secret due to the embarrassment of the failed expedition, which, I mean, that's fair. Ultimately, the expedition serves as a kind of like a final nail in the coffin of the Northwest Passage. I mean, the Northwest Passage was eventually navigated by Roald Amundsen, but he did it in a much smaller boat. It took him a lot of time and preparation and still had to deal with ice. The whole goal of the passage was to find a way around India and a viable shipping lane, which it's not. If you're trying to ship goods across the world and try to go this way only to get stuck in the ice for a year, depending on what goods you're trying to take, they're gonna go bad. It's just not a viable thing, and it's just interesting that that was kind of the excuse that we used for it, when in reality, I just like to think that it was really just, hey, I made it first. Do you like ridiculous family drama? Because this is one of the most ridiculous small-town family drama stories I've ever heard. In 1976, a bus driver in Circleville, Ohio, started receiving letters accusing her of having an affair with the school superintendent. She kept the letters quiet from anyone outside of her family before her husband also received a letter stating that if he did not stop his wife's affair, then his life would be in danger. The letters continued for 2 weeks, with the writer threatening to go public with the information. The family of the driver believed that they knew who the person was, and one night her husband received a phone call that seemed to confirm his suspicions. He grabbed his gun and left the house in his pickup truck to go and confront this supposed writer. A few minutes later, he was found dead in his truck after crashing into a tree, with at least 1 bullet fired from his gun. The death was originally suspected to be a murder, but after a suspect passed a polygraph, it was just ruled a simple accident. Several years went by and the letters continued, and then it escalated. The writer started putting signs along the bus route meant to harass the driver until she couldn't take it anymore and went to pull one of the signs down and found a booby-trapped box with a gun set to fire if it was pulled. And the insane part is that not only did it not go off, but the gun belonged to her brother-in-law. He claimed that the gun had been stolen and that he wasn't the writer of the letters, but he was arrested, charged, and sentenced to prison for attempted murder. And the crazy part is, the letters kept going, even being sent to the brother-in-law while he was in jail. And one of the people at the jail was getting tired of it and locked the guy in solitary, hoping the letters would stop. They didn't. Okay, so we have a dead husband, the wrong guy put in prison, and a still unidentified writer. How could this get more ridiculous? The bus driver and the superintendent later admitted that they had a relationship, but said it only started after the letters began, which has to be the dumbest, most morally corrupt thing I've heard in a really long time. So if they had a relationship that didn't start until after the letters, it meant that they received the letters and thought, they already think we're screwing, so we might as well. That's the most juvenile high school bullshit I have ever heard. Either that or the letter writer was correct the entire time, and this woman who couldn't stay loyal to her husband ended up getting him killed and her brother-in-law wrongfully thrown in prison. Which leads me to my theory. I think the bus driver did it. I think she knew her family well enough that she could manipulate them into believing that these letters were just trying to harass her. That she got her husband drunk before having her accomplice call him and get him driving so that he crashed his truck, thus removing him from the equation, and then she stole her in-law's gun and made the box herself to blame him and get him out of her life too. And regardless of if my theory is true or not, she is far from standing on moral high ground. If she's sleeping with a dude while she's married, that's adultery. We used to stone people for that. Some places still do. And if she waited until her husband's body was room temperature, it's still not a good thing to be doing. It's at least to some degree fraternization, right? Bus driver, superintendent, seems like fraternization to me. It's no good either. The story makes my family drama seem so small, and I'm somehow kind of thankful for the drama that we have. And if that story doesn't make you want to stay as far away from Ohio as possible, this one might. The Cleveland Torso murders occurred from September 5th, 1934 to August 16th, 1938 in, you guessed it, Cleveland, Ohio. And just like the Jack the Ripper killings, these murders took place in the poorest part of the city known as Kingsbury Run, or the Hobo Jungle as it was often referred to, due to the large number of bars, brothels, and the large presence of homeless people. It was also where a large number of Hoovervilles or shanty towns had been set up, since it was the Great Depression after all. While estimates vary, it's widely accepted that there are 12 confirmed victims of the Torso murderer, with only 2 being definitively identified. And you might be wondering, that's odd. Why would they only be able to identify 2 of 12? That sounds like really bad police work. Firstly, dear viewer, you have to remember that this was the 1930s. Some people didn't even have birth certificates back then, and record keeping was nothing like it is today. And secondly, because the bodies were often found in such horrible states of decay that no identifiers existed, especially since this was predating genetic testing. Oh, yeah, and there's also the fact that the killer removed the victims' heads. Yeah. I won't go into too terrible details on these ones because frankly, I'm tired and a little depressed from this video, but also because most of the bodies were found in the same or similar fashion. The killer would often kill the person by slitting their throat and then decapitating them completely. He would then often dismember them and then cut their torso in half. After killing them, he would transport and dump the bodies, oftentimes in water features, but sometimes he would also just bury them, and many of the victims were found upwards of several months, even to a year after their murder. He also burned them quite a lot, which also made identifying the bodies more difficult for the police. And just like Jack the Ripper, the Torso murderer knew that the police were looking for him, and he wanted to taunt them just like the Ripper. No, not by sending them letters or a box including a kidney. He placed one of the victims' bodies in direct view of the lead investigator's office. Now, I know what you're thinking. They should be able to catch him if he moved the body in front of the office. Well, he likely did it at nighttime when the office was closed. That one's fairly easy to get past. But who was the lead investigator of the Cleveland Torso murders? Elliot Ness. Yeah, the guy who took down Al Capone was the lead investigator of these murders, and he was hell-bent on finding the killer. Ness was so committed to finding the killer that he would organize raids disguised as safety inspections on the shanty towns in the area in order to not only search for the killer, but also to gather fingerprints of people living in the area so they could identify them if they became potential victims. Oh, he also burned down one of the shanty towns in a hope to clear out the area and keep people safe from the potential murder, which, on one hand, I get that he's trying to keep things and people safe by removing them from these horrific living conditions and clearing out the area of a potential murderer and body disposal locations. But on the other hand, I imagine it may have just led to more crime and death due to the fact that now there's no shelter. I don't know, that one's complicated. Ness would also personally interrogate his prime suspect, Francis Sweeney, a surgeon with experience with amputations from his time in World War I and that had practiced in the area of Kingsbury Run, and whose office was located very close to a morgue that was suspected to be the place he cleaned and dismembered the bodies. Ultimately, the evidence against Sweeney was ruled circumstantial, and after Sweeney checked himself into an institution to fight extreme alcoholism, no further leads into his involvement were found. However, he did send Ness postcards containing vague threats until Ness's death in 1957, so who knows? There were several other potential suspects, one of which was actually arrested for the murder of one of the identified victims and confessed to it, only to rescind his confession stating that it was beaten out of him, because the 1930s. He would later be found hanged in his cell of a suspected suicide, although there were rumors that he was murdered, and he would ultimately be exonerated of any connection to the Torso murders. If only he could have hung on a little longer. The only other possible suspect was a black man named Willie Johnson, who was later convicted of a similar murder in 1941, being caught disposing of a torso and having the legs of a woman in his house. He was never conclusively connected to the murders and was killed via the electric chair in 1944. And the true identity of any killer remains a mystery, and just like any of the others, we will probably never know because it's been decades and crime is still happening today, and anyone with any connection to the victims is long dead, which I guess is a sad reality that only the living really care about justice. Thankfully, there's a final judgment, and those unidentified monsters and justice will ultimately be served, but until then, and God willing, I'll keep making videos talking about these sorts of things, and you guys will keep watching them. But until next time, don't trust a smelly homeless Russian who claims that he can heal you if you touch his magic scepter, don't fly with Malaysian Airlines, and stay as far away from Ohio as possible. But most importantly, go live a story worth telling, and I'll see you in the next one. The end.